Hey guys, I hope you're all doing well. Since we didn't have an opportunity to talk about changes in the circulatory system after birth in class, I thought I would put together a short narration on that as you study for your next exam. In order to talk about how the changes occur, I need to introduce you to how the pattern of circulation happens in the adult. So this is an image showing you how the circulatory system is arranged, and I want to talk about the order of events. So initially, blood returns to the heart, coming from the vena cava. The vena cava, there's an inferior part and a superior part that come, the inferior coming from the majority of your body and the superior part coming from your head, and all of that drains into the right atrium of your heart. Blood from the right atrium flows through a valve into the right ventricle of your heart, and as that right side of your heart contracts, it pushes blood through a valve that is between your ventricle and the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery sends blood from the right ventricle to the lungs, where it picks up oxygen. Oxygenated blood leaves the lungs and it moves into the left side of the heart, specifically the left atrium. When the left atrium fills up, blood moves through a set of valves into the left ventricle. When the left ventricle contracts, oxygenated blood is ejected into the aorta, and blood from the aorta flows through other parts of our body to distribute the oxygen that has been picked up. Then when the oxygen is picked up in the tissues, the unoxygenated or relatively unoxygenated blood is returned via the vena cava back to the right side of the heart, and this whole process repeats. So looking at the baby image on the right, you see that those arrows correspond to exactly the last picture that I showed you, where blood moves from the blue vena cava into the blue right side of the heart. That blue indicates the lack of oxygen in the blood, moving from the atrium to the ventricles into the pulmonary artery, distributes it to the lungs where oxygen can be acquired. Oxygenated blood returned to the left side of the heart, moving from the left atrium to the left ventricle, and from the left ventricle to the aorta, so that that oxygenated blood can be distributed. As we said in class the other day, however, in a fetus, the lungs aren't used to supply oxygenated blood. Rather, the oxygenated blood comes from the mother through the umbilical vein. That umbilical vein attaches to the vena cava, as you can see in the baby picture on the left. The vena cava then has oxygenated blood that mixes with the baby's relatively unoxygenated blood to enter the right atrium. That blood doesn't need to go into the right ventricle because we don't need to go to the lungs, so we can bypass them. So rather than going to the right ventricle, blood moves through we'll call it a hole or a space between the right atrium and the left atrium. That space is called the foramen ovale. So blood can move either from the right atrium to the right ventricle, or probably more easily can move from the right atrium to the left atrium. Any blood that moves into the right ventricle would, as the baby's heart beats, get pushed into the pulmonary artery. However, there is a second pathway that can divert blood away from the lungs, and that is in the form of the ductus arteriosus. The ductus arteriosus is a pathway between the pulmonary artery and the aorta. So in this way, blood can completely bypass the left side of the heart and move to the fetus's body. So this foramen ovale and ductus arteriosus are present in the fetus, but must be closed very rapidly when the baby is born. So on the left side, we see a sort of increased size image of a heart with an open foramen ovale. Blood moves again in the right atrium and can completely bypass the right ventricle by moving through the foramen ovale into the left atrium. Sometimes this foramen ovale remains open, doesn't close fully when a baby is born. This is termed a patent foramen ovale, and in common language is frequently referred to as a hole in the heart that can be surgically remedied, oftentimes during childhood, but sometimes these patent foramen ovales are not noticed until adulthood. Usually a person would go to the doctor because they were feeling unusually tired, were unable to participate in active sports, or were having shortness of breath. The ductus arteriosus sometimes also does not close fully. Here is the ductus arteriosus moving between the pulmonary artery and the aorta. Failure of the ductus arteriosus to close is much more rare, but it can happen, and this produces what we call a patent ductus arteriosus. Again, this very likely would be diagnosed in a child. I have not heard of instances when it was diagnosed in adulthood, but I suppose that it's possible. In any event, I just wanted to bring you guys up to speed on this to give you a little mini lecture, so to speak, on this topic. And this is the format that I hope that the rest of our coursework will be presented in for the rest of the semester. It's not optimal, but it's what we've got to do. Let me know if it's not good enough and we'll make changes. Good luck on the exam, and stay in touch.